Everybody, hope you're all keeping very well. Okay, so today we are going to look at employment part 2. By the end of this lesson, everybody should be happy with telling me about employee and employer's rights and responsibilities. We should all have a good understanding of what industrial relations means. We should all then be aware of what an industrial dispute is and different ways that industrial action can be taken, and the role of trade unions in employment. Okay, but before we get started on all that, let's just recap on what we have seen in relation to this topic so far. So last lesson, we looked at 3 types of activity, or I guess work, people would do. Okay, so we saw employment, we saw work, and we saw volunteerism. Okay, and the one similarity between those 3 things is that they all require effort. Okay, so in here in the middle, they all require effort. And most of the time when we do one of these 3 things, we are rewarded in some shape or form. Okay, so if we think about general work, it requires our time, it requires our effort, and examples of it might be housework, might be homework, might be schoolwork. And normally we're rewarded with good results, satisfaction of having a lovely clean home, or seeing results. Okay, but the thing about this kind of work is we don't tend to get paid for it. Okay, and that's a similarity then with volunteerism. Okay, so volunteerism is when we willingly give our time and offer to do work, normally for a good cause. Okay, so we might volunteer for a charity, we might volunteer to help out with a local youth group, etc. Okay, and we can do this on a part-time or a full-time basis. And then the last one that we saw was employment, which most people will go into when they're either 18 and they leave school, or when they're 20 something and they leave university and they finish their education. Okay, and for employment, we're talking about paid employment. So you receive a financial reward for this one. That's what makes it different to the other 2. Okay, it requires effort, it requires time. When you're employed, you'll either work for yourself, so you'll be self-employed, or you'll work for a company, you'll work for somebody else who will be your employer. Okay, there's different options, which we saw last lesson. You might work full-time, you might work part-time. You might have a temporary employment position. We see a lot of this maybe over Christmas when shops need more sales assistants. You may be a permanent employee. You may job share, or you may work flexi time. Okay, and when you sign up for employment or when you become employed, you will always receive a contract of employment from your employer. Okay, and this is the one we're going to go into more detail in today's lesson. Okay, so we're going to look at what it's like when you do become employed, because one day all of you will be in employment. So you want to know exactly what your rights and responsibilities are. So when you go into a job, there will be 2 people that we need to think about. Okay, so we will have the employee, who is the worker, and we'll have the employer, who is basically your boss. Okay, and basically a relationship will exist between these 2 people. And ideally we want this to be a good relationship. Okay, so when we talk about industrial relations, it's basically the relationship that exists between the employer, the company, the boss, and his or her workers, okay, or his or her employees. Okay, and in order for those relationships to be smiley, happy, positive relationships, each of these groups of people has different rights and responsibilities that must be met. Okay, so we're going to look at those for the moment, and then we'll come back and talk about this bottom bit. So let's start off with an employer. So imagine you set up your own company and you were the boss. What do you think your rights would be? Okay, so as an employer, your rights, you have the right to hire suitable staff. Okay, so suitable staff for the job vacancies that you have. You have the right to decide on what your company objectives are going to be. If you have unsuitable staff or you have dishonest staff, you have the right to dismiss those staff. And we will look at that in the next session when we look at employment law. And you have the right to demand or to expect loyalty and respect. Okay, so they're just some of your rights as an employer. But as an employer, you also have a certain number of responsibilities to your employees. Okay, so you are responsible for paying them the agreed wages. You are responsible for ensuring that the workplace that they're in is safe and following health and safety legislation. You are responsible for providing your employees with adequate leave. So that could be holiday leave, it could be sick leave, etc. It's breaks as well, actually, during the day, the working hours. Think back to our pay slips. Okay, so remember when we get our pay slip, we see our gross pay and our net pay. We don't need to worry about paying our PAYE and our PRSI and our USC. Our employer has that responsibility. They have a responsibility to not discriminate against any of their employees. And we will look at that when we look at employment law next session. And they also have a responsibility to comply with the law. Okay, so from an employer perspective, these are their rights and responsibilities. If you want to pause the slide or the video now and take these down, you can, but everything is going to be on the PowerPoint that you're going to work your way through in this lesson. Okay, so most likely when you guys do go out into the labour market, you're going to be an employee to begin with. Okay, and it's really important that you know your rights and your responsibilities as an employee. And again, you can pause the video at any point and take these down, or they're also on the PowerPoint. So when you do start working, your first right, or the first thing you're entitled to is a fair and honest wage. Okay, so you must be paid at least minimum wage. And this will be stated in your contract. When you first take a position of employment, you have a right to be given a contract, which must be signed by you and your employer. And if you remember last lesson, we saw all the different components of a contract of employment. You have the right to work in a safe, healthy, hygienic environment. You have the right to adequate breaks during your working day. You have the right to work fair working hours. So your employer can't make you work 24 hours in a row, etc. You have the right to holiday, sick, maternity, paternity pay, and you have the right to respect. Okay, so they're just some of your rights as an employee. But as we look at the employment law next session, we'll understand those a little bit more. But then you also have some responsibilities. So when you sign a contract, you agree to be an employee of that company, and you have the following responsibilities. So you have to be loyal and not disclose any confidential information. You have to turn up on time and be punctual. You have to carry out your duties or your responsibilities, and they will be in the job description and the job advertisement. That'll probably be discussed in your interview. You are responsible for respecting the company, for respecting your employer and respecting other employees. You are responsible for following the rules, for wearing a uniform and any PPE or safety equipment that might be required in the job, and to attend any training that's provided by your employer. Okay, so they're the main rights and responsibilities of an employee. And the next thing then that we're going to look at is, well, what if these rights are not being met? Okay, so what if I'm not being paid a fair wage? What if I'm being taken advantage of and being made work much longer hours than I stated in my contract? Okay, and that's when this relationship might start to go a little bit bad. Okay, or turn a little bit sad. Okay, and what may happen then is between these two groups of people, there's an industrial dispute. Okay, so they're having a little bit of a disagreement or a fight. And if that disagreement can't be resolved, it could get serious and the workers might take industrial action. But before that happens, what will normally happen is if you feel that you're being discriminated against, or your employer isn't carrying out his responsibilities, or your employer isn't meeting your rights, then normally people will go to a trade union. Okay, and a trade union is basically a representative. So it's a group. So you will have heard of maybe SIPTU. And each month we pay them a fee. And the reason we pay them a fee is because they protect workers' rights. Okay, so they will advise us on our rights. If we feel we have an issue with our employer, we can go to our trade union and they'll give us advice. They might step in and support us, and they might negotiate with our employer. Okay, the next stage then would be if this industrial dispute cannot be resolved. So if the trade union can't get employers and employees to reach an agreement, they might recommend then that the employees take industrial action. Okay, and you've probably heard loads of examples of this in the news. So for example, maybe with nursing staff, been unhappy with their hours and with their pay, they would have gone to their trade union. The trade union would have tried to negotiate with the employers, so with the hospitals or the government, and they didn't reach a solution. Okay, so the next step then was for them to take industrial action. Okay, and there's loads of different ways that we can take industrial action, but the 5 you need to be familiar with are these 5 listed here. Okay, so the first one is to go out and strike. Okay, and going on strike basically means you set up a picket outside the place of employment and you stop working for a day, for 2 days, for 3 days. And there's loads of examples in the news about different organisations, different employees who have gone out on strike. A second one is a work to rule. Okay, and when you work to rule, you basically do the bare minimum, so you don't go above and beyond. Okay, so an example of that could be possibly teachers. They just teach their classes, they just do their corrections, they don't run any extracurricular activities, they don't run lunchtime clubs, so you do the bare minimum in your contract. Okay, the third one is a go slow, and as that name implies, you literally do your work, but you do it at a much slower pace. So productivity slows down for the organisation. The fourth one is an overtime ban. And basically what would happen there is you just, you avoid or you state that you're not going to do any overtime. You literally just do your basic hours. And then a token stoppage is where employees stop at certain points throughout the day. So they might, for example, if it was transport, they might work between 7 and 10 rush hour, and then they might go on a mini strike from 10 to 1, and then they might work again in the afternoon. So they stop at various points throughout the working day. Okay, so that's our very, very quick run through of all the content in today's lesson. But what I'm going to ask you to do now is work through the PowerPoint. There are notes obviously to take, and there are activities to test you and make sure you're understanding all this content correctly. Okay, any questions, send them my way.